They tell us the Emperor's justice is blind. They lie. Justice's eyes, and mine are tired of what they see. In the cold vacuum between the stars, we speak of the Inquisition as a shield. But what happens when that shield becomes a jagged shard of glass, driven into the throat of the guilty by a man who died in a park 10 millennia before he was born? I found a file in the deepest vaults of the Ordo Malleus. It wasn't written in high Gothic. It was scratched in the soot of a burned-out city, signed with a skull that wasn't a symbol of the Imperium, but a promise of a cold, methodical end. The warp spat him out, a relic of a primitive age, a soldier of a forgotten war. He didn't ask for a rosette. He didn't want a throne. He just wanted the names of those who let the galaxy rot. Tell me, in a universe where innocence is merely a lack of evidence, how long does it take for Frank Castle to run out of bullets? The transition was not a flash of light. It was the sound of the universe tearing like wet cardboard. One moment, the air in that New York basement smelled of cordite and ozone, the dying breath of a localized reality warp. The next, the oxygen was replaced by the taste of processed filth and metallic tang of a billion souls screaming in the dark. I didn't fall, I was spat out. I hit the deck plates of Hive Primus with the weight of a man who had already died once. My fingers still lock around the grip of a Colt .45 that felt suddenly terrifyingly small. The architecture here doesn't just house people. It devours them. Looking up, the spires of the Hive didn't end in the sky. They pierced the throat of the heavens, choked by a smog so thick it felt like breathing ash. I've seen hells in the eyes of the men I've killed, but this was a factory for it. I didn't have time to mourn the world I lost. Movement in the shadows, the wet, rhythmic clicking of something that wasn't human, or at least hadn't been for a very long time. Out of the hab sludge rose a group of scavengers, their flesh grafted with rusted iron, eyes replaced by flickering red lenses that leaked oily fluid. They didn't see a man, they saw meat and salvage. They moved with a twitchy, mechanical hunger, brandishing jagged blades and stub pistols that looked like they'd been hammered together in a nightmare. I stood my ground, the weight of the Kevlar vest feeling like a paper shield against this new brand of madness. They barked something in a gutter tongue that sounded like grinding gears. I didn't need a translator to know. They were debating which part of me to eat first. The first one lunge, a twitching mass of wires and necrotized muscle. I didn't think. I reacted. The .45 barked twice, the sound swallowed instantly by the cavernous roar of the Hive. The rounds hit home, but these things don't die like men. The lead flattened against reinforced bone, only slowing the creature down. I had to go for the optics. 3 shots, rapid fire, a rhythmic pulse of violence that dropped the leader into the muck. The others hesitated, their primitive processors struggling to reconcile the speed of a 21st century operator with the lethargy of their usual prey. I realized then that my ammunition was a finite resource in a galaxy that measured its casualties in trillions. Every trigger pull was a countdown to my own extinction. That's when the law arrived. Not the police, nothing so civilized. The Adeptus Arbites surged through the fog like armored gargoyles, their shock mauls glowing with a hateful blue electricity. They didn't ask questions. They didn't offer a hand. They opened fire on everything that moved, their massive combat shotguns, bolters, I'd later learn, tearing chunks out of hab walls and scavengers alike. I dove behind a stack of rusted Prometheum barrels, watching as the justice of this world unfolded. It was cold. It was efficient. It was a massacre disguised as an arrest. I saw an Arbite crush a scavenger's skull under a heavy boot, without breaking stride. In that moment, I realized I wasn't in the city anymore. I was in a cage, and the wardens were just as vicious as the inmates. I waited until the smoke cleared, my shadow merging with the grime of the lower levels. One Arbite remained, checking the corpses with the practiced indifference of a butcher. He saw me, or rather, he saw the white skull painted on my chest, illuminated by the guttering flickering of a nearby plasma conduit. He paused, his gloved hand hovering over his holster. To him, the skull was a symbol of the Emperor's holy death. To me, it was a warning. We stared at each other across a chasm of 10,000 years. He didn't see a heretic. He saw an impossibility. And as I disappeared into vents, I made my first vow in this new, rotting world. I'm going to find out who runs this slaughterhouse. And then I'm going to make them pay. The darkness of the lower levels didn't last. They didn't find me by luck. They found me by math. The Inquisition doesn't just hunt. They sift through the data screens of a city until the anomaly becomes a target. I was cornered in a subvault that smelled of ozone and ancient, rotting parchment. I'd spent 48 hours scavenging, replacing my 9mm rounds with crude, heavy-grain slugs I'd hammered into casings. When the wall detonated, it wasn't a breach. It was a surgical removal of my exit. Through the dust walked a man draped in furs and layered flak armor, his face a map of scars and cybernetic ports. Inquisitor Vane. He didn't look like a judge. He looked like a high-end hitman with a god complex. Behind him, a pair of servo skulls hovered, their surgical lasers painting red dots across the white skull on my chest. I didn't drop my gun. I've seen that look before, the look of a man who thinks he owns a room because he owns the law. You are a ghost, Frank Castle. Vane's voice was a low rasp, amplified by a vox grill in his throat. He spoke my name like an insult to his understanding of the universe. I was strapped into an iron chair in a room that had seen more pain than a combat hospital. The air was thick with the scent of incense and burnt hair. He didn't use a rubber hose. He used a neural scourge, a whip of flickering energy that didn't just hurt the skin. It screamed directly into the nerves. He wanted to know about the rift, about the ancient Terra markings on my gear, and why my DNA looked like something pulled from a pre-unification time capsule. Every strike was a question. Every silence was a choice. He called it purification. I called it Tuesday. I've been broken by professionals, and Vane, for all his golden baubles, was just another man trying to extract a truth that didn't belong to him. He made a mistake. He thought my silence was defiance. It wasn't. It was observation. While he lectured me on the divine will and the cancer heresy, I was looking at the way his hand-cranked interrogation rack was bolted to the floor. The Imperium builds things to last, but they don't build things to be smart. I felt the hairline fracture in the rusted iron of my left restraint, a structural weakness born of 10,000 years of neglect. I didn't need a miracle. I needed physics. When he leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale stems and amasec, I didn't spin his face. I waited for the neural scourge to cycle. The moment the energy hum dipped, I threw my weight. The iron groaned, then snapped. I didn't go for his throat. I went for his belt. I spent a lifetime learning that a man's tools are his only real power, and Vane's belt was a goddamn armory. The room exploded into a chaotic blur of silver and red. I didn't have my 1911, but I had a stolen crock grenade and a very clear idea of where the ventilation shaft was. Vane's retinue, a group of hooded acolytes with more wires and brains, scrambled to intercept, but they were used to broken heretics. Not a man who treats a torture chamber like a tactical playground. I used the chair as a shield, the heavy iron catching a flurry of needle rounds. I wasn't looking for a fair fight. I was looking for a way to turn his holy sanctum into a coffin. I jammed the grenade into primary power conduit. The resulting surge didn't just kill the lights. It fried the servo skulls, sending them crashing to floor like expensive garbage. In the strobe light flicker of the dying electronics, I saw Vane's eyes. For the first time, they weren't filled with judgment. They were filled with the realization that he'd invited a shark into his fishbowl. I vanished into the dark, but I didn't leave empty-handed. I took a data slate and a jagged piece of his pride. As I crawled through the arterial pipes of the hive, the realization hit me like a gut punch. This empire of man wasn't a civilization. It was a protection racket on a galactic scale. The Inquisitors were just the capos, and the Emperor was the boss who never left his office. They didn't want to save humanity. They wanted to manage its misery. Vane thinks he's hunting a relic, a curiosity from a dead age. He's wrong. He's hunting a man who has spent his entire life killing monsters that wear badges. And in a galaxy full of gods and demons, the man with nothing left to lose is the only one who can actually see the target. The war hasn't changed, only the scale. I didn't head for the surface. You don't win a war by running. You win by finding the enemy supply line and cutting it until they bleed out. The lower levels of Hive Primus are a labyrinth of forgotten industry and recycled flesh. I found a sanctuary in a hollowed-out cooling unit, a place where the air was cold enough to mask my heat signature from the inquisitorial sweeps. My first priority was the gear. The .45 was a museum piece here. It didn't have the punch to stop a man-thing with a chest plate made of tank hull. I spent 3 days hunting the hunters. I tracked a group of Underhive enforcers, corrupt thugs who shook down the local dreg markets for protection money. They moved with the arrogance of men who thought the skull on their shoulder made them invincible. I showed them that a skull is just a target. I didn't use a gun. I used a length of industrial wire and a heavy-duty mag clamp. By the time I was done, I had what I needed, a bolt pistol. It's not a gun. It's a handheld cannon that fires self-propelled, high-explosive miniature rockets. The first time I felt its weight, I knew this wasn't justice. This was an executioner's tool. Learning to use the bolter was a lesson in violence. The recoil doesn't just kick, it tries to dislocate your shoulder. But the results are undeniable. I tested it on a local cult cell I'd been scouting, the Children of the Copper Vein. They weren't worshiping the Emperor. They were bowing to something older, something that smelled of rot and stagnant water. They were middlemen, smuggling volatile chemicals into the hive's water supply. I didn't give them a speech. I didn't read them their rights. I stepped out of the steam vents and turned their makeshift temple into a slaughterhouse. A bolter round doesn't just kill a man, it deletes him. It turns a torso into a fine red mist and bone fragments. As I stood over the remains of their priest, I realized the horrifying truth of this millennium. In a world where everything is a monster, the only way to stay human is to be the biggest monster of them all. The ghost of the Underhive became a legend in the span of a week. The dregs started calling me the Pale Judge. I wasn't just killing criminals. I was disrupting the delicate ecosystem of corruption that Vane and his Ordo relied on. I found a hidden cache of old-world explosives, primordial seed that is stabilized into something much more temperamental. I didn't hoard it. I planted it. I targeted the high-end manufactums that paid tithes to the local planetary governors in exchange for turning a blind eye to the mutant slave trade. I watched from the shadows as the elite's precious profit margins went up in a plume of Prometheum fire. It's funny, whether the mob boss in Hell's Kitchen or a hive governor on Necromunda, they all scream the same way when you take their toys away. They think they're untouchable until the fire starts licking at their heels. But the Inquisition isn't the police. They don't just respond to crime. They adapt to a threat. Vane didn't send more enforcers. He stopped trying to arrest me and started trying to outthink me. He sent psychic spies, astropaths who could smell a ripple in the warp. I felt them before I saw them. It was a pressure behind the eyes, a cold, oily sensation that crawled across my skin like insects. They were looking for a mind print, a psychic signature to lock onto. But my mind isn't a normal target. It's a graveyard. It's filled with the ghosts of Maria and the kids, and 1,000 battlefields that this galaxy has forgotten. The trauma acted like a lead shield. I watched one of those hooded freaks scream and collapse as he tried to peer into my head. He didn't find a heretic. He found a man who had already survived the end of his world, and that terrified him more than any demon ever could. I'm no longer just a man out of time. I'm a virus in their system. Every corrupt official I execute, every tainted shipment I blow sky high, I'm sending a message to the Golden Palace at the top of this rusted needle. I'm not here to save your souls. I'm not here to join your holy war. I'm here to finish mine. I've started painting the skull on my new gear. Not the small, subtle one from before, but a massive, jagged white grin across the chest of my stolen carapace armor. Let them see it. Let them know that the Ordos aren't the only ones who can judge. There's a new law in the Underhive, and it doesn't care about your ties or your faith. It only cares about the body count. And the bill is coming due. I didn't hear him coming. That was my first mistake. I was busy field stripping a jammed heavy stubber in a crawl space beneath a Prometheum refinery when the air simply froze. The hum of the hive died. It wasn't a tactical breach. It was a cessation of reality. Inquisitor Vane didn't come with a small army this time. He came with a psychic null, a blank, a woman whose mere presence felt like a void in the soul, sucking the air out of my lungs. I reached for my blade, but my limbs felt like lead. Vane stepped into the dim light, looking older, more tired. He didn't point a weapon. He held out a small, silver seal, the Inquisitorial Rosette. It didn't represent the law. It represented the power to burn worlds. You've done more damage to the hidden rot of this sector in 3 weeks than my acolytes have done in a century, he rasped. He wasn't there to kill me. He was there to recruit a man who was already a ghost. We sat in the ruins of a desecrated chapel, the headless statues of saints watching us with stony indifference. Vane told me about the Ordo Excorium, the ones who handled the betrayal from within. He spoke of radicalism, the philosophy of using the enemy's weapons to save a dying empire. He knew I didn't care about his God Emperor. He knew I didn't care about the great work. He looked me dead in the eye and showed me a list of names. Governors who traded human lives for Xenos tech. Cardinals who feasted while their sectors starved. The Imperium is a body dying of gangrene, Vane said, his mechanical eye whirring as it focused on the skull on my chest. I am a doctor who has run out of medicine. You are the scalpel. I can't offer you a home, castle, but I can offer you a list of people who deserve to die. I looked at the silver seal. In my world, a badge was something you respected or something you feared. Here, it was a license to commit any atrocity in the name of a higher cause. If I took it, I became part of the machine I hated. If I didn't, I'd eventually run out of luck, bullets, or air. But there was a third option. I reached out and took the rosette, but I didn't pin it to my chest. I pulled out a combat knife and carved a deep, jagged line to the center of the silver eagle. I wasn't going to be his agent. I was going to be his consequence. I told him I'd take the names. I'd take the transport. I'd take the gear. But the moment his holy mission crossed the line into tyranny, he was next on the list. He smiled a thin, bloodless expression. He knew he was making a deal with a demon. He just didn't realize he'd already lost control of the contract. The transition from vigilante to inquisitorial asset was seamless and surgical. They gave me a ship, a stealth-class cutter, named the Deliverance. It was a black needle designed to slip through the warp without being noticed. Vane tried to assign me a team of elite stormtroopers, men trained to die without question. I sent them back. I don't work with soldiers who follow orders. I work with survivors who hate the system as much as I do. I went to the penal colonies. I found the ones the Inquisition had discarded. A disgraced sniper, a tech priest who asked too many questions, and a former Arbite who had refused to fire on a crowd of hungry workers. I didn't give them a speech about duty. I told them we were going to find the men who put them in chains, and we were going to end them. It was the first time I'd seen a group of people in this grim, dark future look like they actually had something to live for. My first official act as an Inquisitor wasn't a trial. It was an audit. I spent hours at the Deliverance's Vox station, listening to the encrypted chatter of the sector. Vane wanted me to start with a cult on the fringes. I had other plans. I tracked a shipment of Grade A ration packs meant for a starving hive world that had been diverted to a private estate on the pleasure moon of Ethelgard. I didn't need a mandate to know that was a death sentence. As we prepped for the jump into the warp, I looked at the card rosette sitting on the tactical map. It wasn't silver anymore. It was stained with the grease of 100 weapons. I'm not an Inquisitor. I'm not a hero. I'm the build that the Imperium has been avoiding for 10,000 years. And I'm coming to collect. Ginus 4 was a world that choked on its own greed. From a bridge of the Deliverance, it looked like a copper coin rotting in a gutter. Planetary Governor Krail had turned his world into a personal fiefdom, selling the planet's oxygen tithes to the highest bidder while the lower-tier workers breathed liquid filth. Vane wanted him arrested for clandestine Xenos trade, but I didn't care about the paperwork. I watched through the long-range scanners as Krail's personal guard, the Gilded Hawks, paraded to the capital in gold-plated carapace armor, oblivious to the fact that their world was a tinderbox. I didn't drop a regiment of guardsmen. I didn't send a formal declaration. I waited for the planet's rotation to hit the midnight hour. Then I dropped into the atmosphere in a stealth pod. Speed, surprise, and a staggering amount of high-grade plastic explosives. That's how you start a conversation with a tyrant. The landing was hard, right into the heart of the governor's private gardens. The Hawks reacted like amateurs, blinded by the luxury of their own posts. I didn't use the bolter immediately. It's too loud, too final. I moved through the topiary like a shark in a kelp forest, using a monomolecular combat knife to thin the herd. One by one, the golden soldiers vanished into the hedges, their throats open before they could key their vox links. I've hunted mobsters in penthouses and cartels in jungles, and the principle is always the same. If you take out the lookouts, the man at the top starts to feel the cold. By the time I reached the grand balcony of the palace, the gardens were silent, decorated with the corpses of men who had traded their souls for a shiny breastplate. I found Krail in his banquet hall, halfway through a glass of vintage Amasek, while his world literally burned below him. He was a fat, sweating specimen of imperial decadence, draped in silks that cost more than a hive sector's annual food budget. He looked at me, a blood-stained shadow with a white skull on my chest, and he didn't even have the dignity to be afraid. He tried to buy me. He offered me titles, women, and a seat at his table. He told me that efficiency required certain sacrifices. I let him finish. I let him think I was listening. Then I pulled the bolt pistol. The sound of it chambering around was the loudest thing in that room. "You're not efficient, Krail," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You're a leak, and I'm the plug." The rest lasted exactly 3 seconds. Krail's hidden security servitors lunged from the tapestries, mechanical monstrosities with heavy stubbers for arms. I didn't dodge. I moved through the fire. I used a frag grenade to create a screen of dust and shrapnel. Then I put a bolt round to the primary processor of the lead servitor. The explosion of sparks and hydraulic fluid sprayed across the governor's fine linens. Krail screamed, reaching for a vox caster to call for his army. I shot the caster out of his hand. Then I walked up to him and grabbed him by the throat. He started to plead, talking about the holy lex and his rights as a servant of the throne. I didn't give him a trial. I gave him a view of the street below, where the people he had robbed were starting to break down the palace gates. I didn't kill him with a bullet. That would have been too clean. I threw him from the balcony into the arms of the crowd he had spent a lifetime starving. As the screams of the gilded governor faded into the roar of revolution, I turned back to the palace and set the charges. Ginus would need a new governor. It needed a clean slate. I watched from the extraction craft as the palace collapsed in a controlled demolition of fire and stone. Vane was furious when I returned to the deliverance. He said I had destabilized a vital sector. I just handed him Krail's encrypted ledger, a list of every other corrupt official in the subsector. I'm not here to manage the status quo. I'm here to burn the rot out. If the sector falls apart because one fat man died, then it was already dead. The target wasn't a man, it was an infection on the pleasure world of Luthian. The air smelled like rotting lilies and expensive wine, a signature of the Slaneshi cult known as the Gilded Vein. Their leader, an apostate cardinal named Elosian, didn't hide in a bunker. He performed his blasphemies in a cathedral made of glass and bone, surrounded by a choir of screaming, modified slaves. Vane warned me that the warp would try to find a way in, that Elosian's voice could turn a man's blood into liquid fire. I didn't listen to the warning with my ears. I listened with my gut. I climbed the spire of a neighboring hablock, a 3-mile crawl through the vents and the smog, carrying a long-lost sniper rifle I'd modified with a custom-milled suppressor. Down there in the glass cathedral, they were celebrating the beauty of the flesh. Up here in the cold, I was celebrating the beauty of a clean kill. I peered through the scope, and the universe shifted. It wasn't just a lens. The sights were calibrated to detect the psychic shimmer of the warp. Elosian appeared in the crosshairs, not as a man, but as a pulsating, iridescent wound in reality. His skin seemed to flow like mercury, and every word he spoke sent ripples of violet light through the air, causing the congregation to weep in ecstatic agony. Then the whispers started. They didn't come from the wind. They came from inside my own skull. They sounded like Maria. They sounded like the kids, calling to me from a park that never existed in this timeline. They promised me peace. They promised that the war could end if I just put the rifle down and stepped into the light. I felt the cold sweat on my palms and the sudden, sickening urge to vomit. Slaynage doesn't fight you with blades. It fights you with your own desires. It found the hole in my heart, the one I've been trying to fill with shell casing for decades, and it tried to pry it open. I saw the faces of every man I'd ever killed, all of them smiling, invited me to join them in a theater of eternal sensation. My finger trembled on the trigger. The shimmer around Illusion grew brighter, mocking me. But the demon made one mistake. It tried to use my pain as a lure. It forgot that my pain isn't a weakness. It's my anchor. I didn't push the memories away. I leaned into them. I remembered the smell of the gunpowder, the heat of a New York summer, and the cold, hard weight of the grief that has kept me moving when any other man would have laid down and died. I turned my trauma into a wall of jagged glass. The voices turned to screams of frustration as I locked the crosshairs onto Illusion's throat. He felt it, that sudden, chilling realization that there was a mind in the dark he couldn't corrupt. He looked up, his mercury eyes searching the spires, but I was already exhaling. I didn't pray to the Emperor. I didn't ask for a miracle. I just pulled the trigger. The long-lost beam was a needle of pure, concentrated light. It pierced the glass dome of the cathedral, ignored the shimmering psychic shield, and took Illusion exactly where the jaw met the neck. There was no blood. There was only a burst of violet smoke and a sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering at once. The gilded vein didn't just die, they unraveled. Without their conduit, the warp retracted like a burned nerve, leaving behind nothing but room full of broken, confused wretches. I sat back in the shadows of the spire, the rifle barrel still hot. My head was pounding, and my vision was blurred with static. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, but the white skull on my chest felt heavier than usual. Vane's data slate flickered in my pocket, already prompting for the next target. I realized then that the demons of this galaxy aren't just in the warp. They're in the silence that follows the kill. They're in the moments when you realize that no matter how many monsters you execute, the ghosts never truly leave. I packed my gear and began the long descent. I'd stopped the infection on Luthien, but the galaxy was still screaming. And as long as it was screaming, I still had work to do. You don't hunt the deadliest predators in the galaxy with a choir of saints. You hunt them with the men who have already looked into the abyss and didn't blink. I returned to Deliverance and wiped Vane's suggested roster of decorated veterans. I didn't want men who fought for medals. I wanted men who fought for a reason to breathe. Our first stop was the black site moon of Orestes, a penal colony with Imperium berries, its most inconvenient soldiers. I walked past the screaming wretches in the common cells and headed for the silent block. I found my first recruit there, Jax, a disgraced Vindicare-trained sniper who had been scheduled for server conversion because he refused to assassinate a whistle-blowing scribe. He sat in the dark, his eyes already adjusted to gloom, measuring my gait before I even reached his bars. He didn't ask who I was. He just looked at the skull on my chest and asked how many targets I had for him. Next was Kroll. He was a mountain of man, a former Ogren handler whose entire squad had been used as fodder for a tyrannid diversion. He had survived by eating his way through a bio-titan's digestive tract, emerging with skin like cured leather and a hatred for the high command that bordered on the religious. He was chained to a slab, his muscles twitching with suppressed rage that the prison guards could only dampen with high-dose sedatives. I didn't give him a speech about the Emperor's mercy. I handed him a heavy-gauge combat shotgun and told him we were going to find the general who signed those divergent orders. The look in his eyes wasn't gratitude. It was a hunger of a wolf being let off a leash. Kroll didn't need a cause. He just needed a direction to charge. The final piece of the puzzle was Muggos Eris, a tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus who had been branded a heretic for unsanctioned logic. He believed that the machine spirit was just a fancy word for a user interface, and he had been caught trying to optimize a Lost Gun's heat sink using forbidden physics. They had stripped most of his augmentations, leaving him a shivering mass of flesh and jagged ports. When I broke him out, he didn't thank me. He spent the first 3 hours on Deliverance recalibrating our sensors, muttering about how the ship's cogitators were suffering from a severe case of religious inefficiency. Eris wasn't a warrior, but he could talk to the ship in ways Vane's priests couldn't. He didn't see the warp as a hellscape. He saw it as a corrupted data stream that needed a firewall. I brought them together in the ship's hold. A sniper with no country, a brute with no master, and a genius with no god. I threw a crate of stolen Imperial gear onto the deck. Black carapace armor, mastercrafted blades, and enough ammunition to level a small moon. I told them the truth. We weren't a kill team. We weren't heroes of the Imperium. We were the Punishers. We were going to operate in the gray spaces where the Inquisition was too afraid or too corrupt to go. I showed them our first target, a space hulk drifting on the edge of the sector, rumored to be the staging ground for a chaos warband led by the very general who had betrayed Kroll. The air in the hold changed. It wasn't the cold vacuum of space anymore. It was the heat of a shared purpose. Training them was like sharpening a serrated blade. We spent weeks in the Deliverance's combat sims, blending my 21st century guerrilla tactics with their 41st century lethality. I taught them how to clear a room without the holy incense slowing them down. I taught them how to set claymores in events and how to use the enemy's own arrogance as a lure. By the time we exited the warp near the Space Hulk, we weren't a group of prisoners anymore. We were a machine. I looked at my crew, each one of them wearing a variation of the skull on their gear, and I felt something I haven't felt since that day in the park. I felt like I was back with my unit. We were going to hell, and for the first time in 10,000 years, I wasn't going alone. The Space Hulk Reef of Ages was a tomb the size of a continent, a fused mass of ancient starships, asteroid rock, and frozen nightmares. We didn't board to the docking bays. That's where the enemy expects the Emperor's fury. Instead, Eris found a structural weakness in an old derelict freighter fused to the hull. We cut our way in through a venting shaft that smelled of 10,000-year-old rot. As we stepped onto the rusted deck plates, the silence was heavy, broken only by the wet thrum of the warp bleeding through the bulkheads. My squad moved like shadows. Jax was already high in the rafters, a silent ghost with long loss. Kroll was my anchor, his shotgun loaded with man-stopper, shells that could punch through a bulkhead. We weren't here for the glory of the throne. We were here because the man leading the Chaos Warband in the center of this maze was General Vance, the man who had left Kroll's unit to be eaten alive for promotion. The deeper we went, the more the ship tried to eat us. The walls weren't just metal. They were weeping a black, oily substance that whispered names of the dead. I saw the ghosts of my own platoon in the flickering shadows of the corridor. Men I'd lost in the desert, their faces replaced by the eyeless sockets of the warp. I felt the familiar pull of the abyss, the siren song of the long sleep. But then I heard the sound of a heavy combat boot hitting the floor and Kroll's low, rhythmic breathing. I remembered that in this galaxy, ghosts don't have bodies. But General Vance did. We bypassed the main guard posts, using Eris's logic jammers to blind the automated turrets. I wasn't interested in the foot soldiers. I wanted the head of the snake. I wanted to see the look on a traitor's face when he realized his past had finally caught up with him in the form of a man with a skull on his chest. We found Vance at what used to be a cathedral ship's bridge, surrounded by his inner circle, corrupt officers who had traded their loyalty for warp-tainted power. They were seated around a table made of bone, plotting their next raid on a defenseless hive world. Vance looked different. His skin was a sickly translucent gray, and his eyes glowed with a pale, unholy light. He was bragging about the necessity of sacrifice when the first smoke grenade hit the center of the table. I didn't wait for the air to clear. I stepped through the fog, my bolt pistol barking a rhythmic, devastating count. The first 3 officers were dead before they could even stand, their torsos vaporized by the high explosive rounds. The room erupted into a symphony of screaming lead and psychic fire. Kroll was a force of nature. He didn't just fire his shotgun. He used it like a club, wading into melee with a roar that shook the very foundations of the Hulk. He found the men who had abandoned his brothers, and he gave them the mercy they deserved, a fast end in the mud of their own making. Meanwhile, Jax was picking off the reinforcement from the shadows, his laser sight a needle of red death that never missed a head. I pushed toward Vance. He tried to summon a shield of warp energy, his hands glowing with a violet flame. But I didn't give him a chance to speak. I slammed into him, the weight of my carapace armor pinning him against the command throne. "You don't get monologue, Vance," I hissed. "You just get the bill." I didn't use a gun. I used a serrated combat knife, driving it through the gap in his armor, where his heart used to be. As the general's life faded, the warp taint in the room began to unravel. The ghosts in the walls went silent, and the heavy pressure in my skull finally lifted. We didn't stay to loot the ship or claim a victory. We set the grief of ages on a collision course with the nearest sun. As we ran for deliverance, I looked back at the burning bridge. Kroll was silent. His massive shoulders slumped, the weight of his revenge finally settling in. Eris was already at the controls, his mechanical arms flying across the console to get us clear of the blast radius. We had done what the Inquisition couldn't. We had closed a file that had been open for decades. But as the sun's gravity began to tear the space hulk apart, I realized the butcher's bill is never truly settled. There's always another name. There's always another debt. And as long as I'm breathing, I'm the one who collects. The High Lords don't like losing their toys, and they certainly don't like a tool that thinks for itself. I was in the Deliverance's armory, recalibrating the tension on my compound bow, when the ship's internal sensors didn't just scream, they died. No alarms, no warnings, just a sudden, absolute silence followed by the sound of a bulkhead being turned into scrap metal. It wasn't a boarding party. It was a single, hyper-accelerated heartbeat thumping through the deck plates. An Eversor Assassin, a drug-fueled, bioengineered nightmare encased in a skull mask that mirrored my own. Before I could even chamber a round in my bolter, the thing was across the room, a blur of black sin skin and twitching, needle-tipped claws. It didn't want to talk. It didn't want to arrest me. It was a programmed hurricane of pure, unadulterated slaughter, and I was the only thing standing in its way. To a normal man, an Eversor is a god of death. To me, it was just a more expensive version of the hitmen I used to dodge in the back alleys of Brooklyn. But this thing was faster. It moved with a jittery, mechanical franticness. Its nervous system overclocked on a cocktail of combat stims that would have liquefied a human heart. I ducked a swipe from its power claw that took a chunk out of support pillar, like it was wet clay. I fired a burst from my bolter, but the assassin didn't dodge. It flowed around projectiles, closing the gap in a fraction of a second. It slammed into me, its weight feeling like a falling building. My ribs didn't just crack. They groaned under the pressure. I realized then that I couldn't outmuscle this monster. I had to outthink it. The fight spilled into the engineering bay, a vertical labyrinth of humming plasma conduits and high-pressure steam pipes. The Eversor was relentless, its twin-linked bolt pistol spitting fire that turned my cover into shrapnel. I took a hit to the shoulder, a grazing blow that cauterized the wound as it passed, but left my left arm numb. I used the environment, lead climbing up the coolant lines, baiting it into the narrow catwalks where its speed would be a liability. I've spent my life learning that the faster a machine runs, the harder it breaks when you jam a wrench in the gears. I waited for it to lunge, a predictable, murderous arc. As it flew through the air, I didn't fire my gun. I triggered the manual override on the primary steam vent. The roar of escaping pressurized gas was deafening. The Eversor was caught mid-air, the superheated vapor stripping the sin skin from its frame and blinding its optical sensors. It hit the catwalk hard, twitching as its internal systems tried to compensate for the sudden trauma. I didn't get a chance to reboot. I dropped from the rafters, driving a monomolecular combat blade into the junction of its neck and shoulder. The thing screamed, a digital, distorted sound that vibrated in my teeth. But an Eversor has a final gift for its enemies, a bio-meltdown that turns its corpse into a thermonuclear explosion. As its heart rate spiked toward the critical threshold, I didn't run. I grabbed a heavy-duty magnetic grappling line and hooked it to the assassin's harness, punching the emergency eject on the airlock. I watched through the reinforced glass as the black silhouette of the assassin was sucked into the cold vacuum of the warp. A second later, a flash of white-hot light illuminated the void, a silent explosion that marked the end of the High Lord's messenger. I leaned against the bulkhead, my breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. My left arm was useless, hanging like dead weight, and my armor was a ruin of scorched ceramite. Eris and Jax found me there, the white skull on my chest cracked and stained with the assassin's acidic blood. I looked at the stump of my arm, then at the empty void outside. They'll send more. They'll send armies next time. But as I walked toward the med bay, I realized I wasn't afraid. I've died once already. Everything since then has just been overtime, and I'm not done punching the clock. We storm Holy Terra with a fleet. We arrive like a whisper in a cathedral. Eris had spent months slaving over the Deliverance's signature, making us look like a ghost in the machine of the Throne World's orbital grid. Stepping onto the surface of the Throne World isn't like visiting a city. It's like walking across a mountain of skulls covered in gold leaf. The air is heavy with the scent of billions of prayers and the dry, metallic tang of an ancient life support system failing on a planetary scale. I didn't bring my squad this time. This was a solo walk. I left my bolter and my blade behind, carrying only the shattered Rosette vein had given me and the weight of a million names I collected across the sector. I walked past the processing centers where thousands of psychers are fed into fire every day just to keep a light on in the dark. I didn't see a holy empire. I saw a furnace that ran on human hope. The inner sanctum was guarded by the custodes, living statues of gold who didn't even acknowledge my presence until I held up the carved silver seal. They didn't see an Inquisitor. They saw a curiosity, a fragment of an era before their long vigil began. They let me pass, perhaps because they were curious, or perhaps because even they are tired of the silence. I entered the throne room, and the scale of the horror finally hit me. It wasn't a palace. It was a machine, a gargantuan, screaming complex of brass and wire that stretched into the darkness above, centered on a single, flickering light. And there he sat, the master of mankind, a rotting husk of bone in psychic agony, trapped in a golden cage of his own making. I've seen men on life support in the VA hospitals, their eyes begging for the plug to be pulled. This was that, magnified by a god complex and 10,000 years of stubbornness. I stood at the base of the throne, the psychic pressure enough to make my nose bleed. I didn't kneel. Why would I? I looked at the thing that was once a man, and for the first time in my life, I felt a kinship with a god. He was a soldier who had been left on the line for too long. He had tried to win a war by becoming a monster, and in the end, the war had simply swallowed him whole. I realized then that the imperial truth was just a lie told to keep the meat moving into the grinder. The High Lords, the Inquisitors, the governors, they weren't serving him. They were scavenging his corpse while he was still conscious enough to feel it. He wasn't a protector. He was a victim, the ultimate victim of a universe that doesn't know how to let go of its dead. I pulled the carved rosette from my pocket and laid it on the cold marble floor. I didn't have a prayer to offer. I had a report. I spoke into the silence, my voice sounding small against the hum of the golden throne. I told him about Ginus, for the grief of ages and the children on the hive levels who would never see the sun because of his grand design. I told him that his justice was a failure and his peace was a graveyard. I expected a thunderbolt. I expected the custodes to end me where I stood. But there was only a ripple in the warp, a sudden, crushing wave of exhaustion that filled my mind. It wasn't anger. It was agreement. He wanted it to end. He was a punisher who would punish himself for eternity, and he was tired. I walked out of the sanctum, past the golden guards and the weeping pilgrims. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had finally seen the end of the road. I boarded the Deliverance and told Eris to set a course for the Fringe. The Imperium will keep grinding on, fueled by the momentum of its own decay. Vane will find a new asset. The High Lord will find new ways to rot. But I'm done being their scalpel. I'm going back to the dark, to the places where the light of the throne doesn't reach. Because out there, in the shadows, there are still people who need someone to stand between them and the monsters. I still have the skull on my chest. I still have the names. And in a galaxy that has forgotten how to be human, I'm the only one left who knows what the price of soul actually is. The war isn't over. It just changed scale. One last time.